in part so that this is an issue that is not unfamiliar to all of everybody in this room, right? We've all been dealing with trust. I have one question for you first, Rob, and then hopefully you guys will jump in with questions that you have for each other. And that is, to what extent do you see and how do you deal with the possibility or the reality that the network of users out there are constantly adapting to whatever changes you're making so that they're always ahead of you and you're always a step behind?
It's an interesting challenge and opportunity, I think, that we face with the availability of real-time metrics. We can see as soon as we put a headline from one of our partners up on our MSN homepage, for instance, instantly how people are reacting. And for years, the editorial team measured itself on editorial click-through rate. And if a headline was good, people were clicking on it, and it became this self-fulfilling prophecy where we would elevate the things that were popular and not necessarily highlight the things that were important. And really, it's been an effort over the last 1 to 2 years to retrain those muscles on the team to not just focus on that one number, but to look broadly at the availability of the content that's out there. Are we being a reflection of the media landscape in the country that we're operating in? And can we get people to not just click the popular things, not just train our personalization algorithms to reward the popular things? We had a sort of famous incident years ago where, it's famous, it's infamous inside my team, where we had our feature slides. There was a disaster happening in the Southeast, and the first slide on the homepage was about recipes for bacon cupcakes. And slide 2 was the important news. And we very quickly made some changes and fixed that. But it was a reflection of what the users were feeding back to us. So we've had to sort of break that feedback loop and focus more on what we think is important, and when we work with our partners to understand what's important and force that to the top, and not get in this cat and mouse game where we're constantly reacting to each other. We think that we have to hold a responsibility and a high bar.
I got questions, but people got questions for each other after their presentations?
Let me dovetail on what you mentioned in terms of this homepage display and in important moments. And a big series of conversations on the Knight Commission was around our technology companies deficient in not bringing human editors to the fore to make judgments about content. And it was a fascinating conversation when you really get to the volume of content that the platforms are trying to manage. And that the sense that we've created something that is almost too large for a phalanx of human beings, eyeballs and hands on keyboards to actually manage. It's that algorithms are literally a necessity if we are to actually have some control over what the platforms display. And so transparency, not only as it relates to media organizations, but transparency as it relates to algorithms being a really critical point. And the opportunities for algorithms to be biased because of the people who are involved in the unconscious biases of the people who are involved in constructing them. So they're actually a similar level of potential pitfalls in terms of technology companies and algorithms as it is in news organizations' bias and news judgment.
Okay, so Joy, I got a question for you, but it connects to Charlie.
Because I have a question for Charlie, so.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. You should probably ask yours first.
Oh, yeah? Okay, sure. So I'm really curious about this idea that news is about a lot more than politics.
Yeah.
And sort of in the fake news climate, I would love to hear any insight you have to share about news coverage of retail trends and health and infrastructure and things that aren't inherently about, they might be political in some way, but not about red state, blue state politics, and what advice you would have for the rest of us when we're covering things that aren't politics about how to demonstrate that credibility and the sort of integrity and benevolence of that work.
No, that's an excellent question, and I do think that that one of the best things that successful journalists do is they tell stories that don't necessarily activate the buttons. It really is interesting that once you get down from the top line of the binary choice of who are you for president, are you red or blue, are you Democrat or Republican, people are much more open to all of that. And so part of this is reestablishing a relationship that, okay, I have interesting information to give you. I am giving you information that is valuable. I'm talking about things that impact your life. These are all ways to reestablish that relationship. I mean, going back to the problem of contempt, if you establish a relationship that I am in your community, I'm on your side, I understand your problems, and I respect you, people are going to absorb pretty much anything that you're willing to tell them. And so, yes, that's a major component of this.
Hope you guys are taking good notes and tweeting it, because I can't take notes up here. That's really good.
Yeah, don't tweet when you're on the panel.
I'm trying to not.
I know it's like, it's tech and all that, but it's okay. It's hard to listen. Okay, here's my question for you, Joy, and it relates to what Charlie had to say, which is, and I say this, Joy, API and Trusty News are part of, we're affiliated. If the first time you ever looked at a journalism book that talked about transparency, it was probably The Elements of Journalism in 2001. So it's not like I'm opposed to transparency.
Got it.
But isn't there some risk that if you say, so here, we're going to show you all the, people we interviewed and all the techniques we use and all of our the discipline of verification that we employ here. Now you should love us. That it completely misses the points that Charlie was making, that I don't even recognize my massive blind spots that I have, the questions that I didn't know to ask, the quiet assumptions I have about people who disagree with me and about their intelligence, their intentions, their morals. What do you do about that in the trust and transparency movement?
So when we work with newsrooms to test out things for transparency, they have a lot of freedom. And we'll say, here's the goal. Let's anticipate what people might want to know about this story you're doing and try to head off, be proactive about some of the misassumptions they might have or things they want to know. And invariably, someone comes back and says, great, we made a 4-minute video about how we found our sources, and we're going to link to it at the end of our stories, and transparency, right? And it's super boring, and it's about something nobody cares about, and it completely misses the fact that the frame of the story is alienating to a good chunk of the audience. So that's why it's got to start by actually understanding mistrust. And I find that I'm really tired of having conversations about how bad comment sections are. They often are, and it's because we're ignoring them and not properly investing in them. But also, we have a lot of feedback loops, and we're just not paying enough attention. We should be investing heavily in understanding the feedback we're getting so that we can say, man, people think this about us? That's crazy. Why would they think that? Okay, so maybe instead of complaining about it over happy hour, we actually come up with strategies to change the story of what we do and what we offer. It's that benevolence and integrity that if they don't think we have that, it doesn't matter what you say about how you found the sources for this story.
Dr. Sykes, do you have something you want to add there?
I'm not a doctor. Don't even play one here.
No. I tell everybody doctor so you can play golf.
Understand that I was part of the Knight Commission and really think that the radical transparency is a very important idea. I agree with that completely. Now, let me tell you, though, the point that I think is the downside of all of this, that sometimes when a media outlet is transparent, they reveal their bias. When reporters go on Twitter and they say what they really think. They're being transparent, but it's like, okay, you're being transparent that you really hate that person or you really despise this particular group. Same thing on cable television. You know, when you have news reporters sitting on the kind of panels that I've been on in the past, they're basically dropping the mask. So there is this, give you one example of a story that illustrated a blind spot where transparency probably was not that helpful. We had a big judicial election in Wisconsin where the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel had a big headline that one of the candidates had received $3,000 from a legal group dubbed a hate group. In the headline, hate group. The group was the Family Research Center, a relatively mainstream social conservative organization. It had been dubbed a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is now going through its own problems. The transparency of this was, whoa, you have just labeled an entire religious community bigots on your front page in a headline, and the more transparent the folks were about it, the worse it got. Because then when they began discussing it on their Facebook pages, it's like, well, if you are this kind of Christian, you are a bigot. Okay, well, you know, that there's an argument to be had and a discussion to be had, but in terms of the way it played out, it generated a massive backlash. That candidate eventually won because of the backlash, and I will tell you that it did not enhance trust in the media the way they handled it. It was a blind spot. If one person in the newsroom who would have said, by the way, this is a pretty well-known organization. We will talk about a large number of your readers here. Maybe you don't want to label them that way, in that particular way. That didn't happen.
Okay, so I want to see Rosenstiel throw that freaking thing as much as possible. I will just say one thing in response to that, and because it gets to a complicated point, which is the first book I ever did was about the '92 campaign. I was inside ABC for a year, and they had a very conservative White House correspondent, Brit Hume, and a very liberal anchor, Peter Jennings. And every script would be negotiated by the executive producer, the anchor, and the correspondent every day, every story. And they would, line by line, and Peter and Brit would they didn't like each other very much. And they would, and Peter's lead in and Brit's script got, edited very closely by each other. And they were better because of that than either of them was when they no longer worked together. But that requires actually recruiting people who disagree with you politically into your newsrooms, which would mean involving, conversations we pretend not to have.
Yeah, it's another layer. It's another layer when we talk about diversity. Right. Diversity of experience, diversity of background, diversity of okay, I'm going to hire somebody who was the private school kid, but also the person who was the daughter of Peace Corps volunteers. It's how do you make sure that you have different life experiences coming together, because those life experiences do come together to form a worldview. And yes, we say as journalists we do our best to set those worldviews aside as we go about reporting the news. But we all know the insidious nature of unconscious bias, and we've got to be conscious of that. Okay.
First draw. Whoa.
To think I didn't want to be a sports reporter. Katie Camp, Cox Media Group, Orlando, and I will say we are primarily a broadcast company. So our research has shown that our local audiences still trust us, but in the last couple of years we've seen some erosion with that, specifically with our affiliates that are Fox affiliates or NBC affiliates, because of the perception NBC's liberal or Fox is hyper-conservative. So my question would be, instead of launching like mass marketing campaigns to separate ourselves from that, what can our reporters or anchors do in practice to reemphasize with conservative and liberal audiences that we are here for everybody?
I think you're going to have some aspect of spillover that you can't control, and I'm a little I also, woke up this morning, flipped on the local news, and I think we've got a Sinclair affiliate in town, and had one of those news segments disguised as opinion, laid out there. So I think local TV is kind of that next battleground for the partisan media money machine to travel to. I think local television has always been successful in building relationships with viewers, and the shorthand I've always used is, we're your buddies, we're your pals, we're your friends, we're on your side. There's a personal nature to local television that is an advantage that local television outlets have compared to local newspapers, where I've spent 30 plus years, and I think you've got to double down on that.
Quickly, any super practical tips that you know, Charlie, from being a radio host, or that you're talking about, Joy, that would answer?
Well, I hope you come find me after, because I would really love to talk to you. We have a ton of on-air examples of what we're working with broadcast partners. Like, often it's about one sentence. It's about injecting into the anchor intro or the social post or the newsletter, like a sentence about the motivation. Here's why we're doing this story, or here's the neutrally framed question we set out to answer. There's so much that we're assuming people understand when they're invited to consume a story that we really need to be spelling out.
I agree with that.
Okay, so another catch. Yes.
Hi there. I'm Lauren Bavis with Side Effects Public Media. My question's for Joy. I really liked your comment about investing in the feedback that we're getting.
The box.
Can you hear me?
closer.
Sorry. It's scary.
We're listening.
I'm talking into a cube. So I think that's a really great practice and idea, but in shrinking newsrooms, it then becomes someone's almost full-time job to babysit a comment section. Yeah, so do you have any...
Yeah. Okay.
Well, it can be somebody's full-time job, or it can be part of everybody's job. And I mean, look, I have no magic solution or illusions about what staffing is like in newsrooms these days. But for me, this is about survival. It's about, what do people think of us, and are they going to continue to come to us? And seriously, are they going to pay us anything at all? And you don't pay for what you don't trust. So fundamentally, I think we've got to prioritize listening to and understanding feedback and incorporating messaging about who we are and what we do into our work.
Okay, another one here. Good catch, despite the...
Imani Benga, AJ Plus senior producer. So what I've seen is in the last few years, we've spent a lot of time talking about trust eroding in media when we really mean journalism. But the problem for me with these conversations is there are communities that never had trust in us. And I'm specifically thinking of people of color who now no longer sit in newsrooms, we're not in positions of power, also women. So even when Walter Cronkite was sitting at the desk, the news wasn't the news in this neutrally framed way. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how to broaden that funnel, right, with the information that we do. So how do we reach communities who have never had our trust, and not just the ones we've recently lost?
Yeah, so I think that's a huge question, because as publications are beginning to say, oh, well, we're going to make our money from subscriptions. So suddenly we're interested in these communities that might subscribe in us, where we didn't care so much about them when we're advertising based, because our advertisers didn't care about them very much. But now we care, because if we could create a Hispanic edition, or a newsletter for Koreans, or a newsletter for Haitians, we might create a little pocket of. And the challenge there is, if you've ignored someone for 70 years and they have no reason to trust you, why would creating a newsletter of content that you don't really have now, why is that going to win them over? I think that's actually another existential question that a lot of publications are. I mean, I get calls probably once a month from somebody saying, what verticals do you know about that we could do for ethnic audiences?
I think part of it is breaking away from this idea that media companies have the exclusive province over journalism. And one of the Knight Commission recommendations is new models for community journalism that are not driven by for-profit enterprises. In many communities across the country, there are what we call community development corporations. Community development corporations are typically created in communities of color, low-income communities. They are primarily focused on issues like affordable housing and education. Why couldn't we not use this same model for local information enterprises? Why couldn't we, for example, use a technique similar to the franking privilege that that members of Congress have to give community media organizations free access to the mail? Because one of the other things related to marginalized communities is marginalized communities may not have access to digital. So how will they get information that's critical?
There's one here. That's easy.
Thank you.
He's Brazilian, so.
Pedro Burgos from ICF Gannett Fellow and Inspire from Brazil. The question is, there's a lot of fake news in, like, if you go to Business Insider, at the bottom there's those tabula and Outbrain and those paid things that are either advertising or fake news on nutrition or health. We talk a lot about misinformation on politics, but what about this? And if this cause more distrust from the public?
Yeah, maybe I can start. And Microsoft partners, for full disclosure, we partner with Taboola and Outbrain and other native content providers in various markets around the world. And I will say, editorially, it's a challenge. We set a very high bar, and we have a high creative acceptance policy for the creatives and the types of advertisers that we'll accept through those platforms. And it's a constant effort on behalf of my team to work with the native providers. We don't accept the salacious headlines that, it's Melissa McCarthy headlines about how, why she's no longer with us, and it's really because, she exited CBS. We spent a lot of time, and usually our first conversations with those providers are all about quality. And they want to talk about how much money we're going to make together, and we just keep bringing it back to quality. And what are the tools that you're going to give us, and the measures that you're going to provide to ensure that that we have good disclosure, we have very strong transparency, and we can maintain a high quality bar. But it's a constant tug of war.
Charlie, and then another question.
This doesn't directly answer your question because I think he did, but there's sort of the elephant in the room that we've been living through since 2016 is the explosion of actual fake news, propaganda, and hoaxes, that are propagated by either hyper-partisans or people who are just, making mischief. I mean, it's almost ignored with the Mueller report coming out, that he's going to, reiterate the findings that we were under attack by people who were weaponizing misinformation, actual misinformation. One of the facts of 2016 that I think is the most mind-boggling is the fact that fake news stories got more traffic than real news stories on places like Facebook. That if you put something out that is completely made up, designed to inflame and divide, you will get a bigger audience, and it may be more marketable than actual, real, truthful information. This is a massive existential problem that I'm not sure that we've fully gotten our heads around how to deal with all that. And I sort of briefly alluded to how hard it is to push back against that if you no longer have trusted, credible sources of fact-based journalism.
Another thing I would add into that conversation is ad fraud. For a while, it seemed like half the time that I tried to follow a Facebook link from my local newspaper, I got one of those spinny things that said, "You've won an Amazon gift card." It's like after a while I stopped trying, and news companies are not known for investing in technological solutions to stuff like that. But of course it affects my perception of the brand. I'm a dedicated news consumer, and I still considered stop trying to follow those links.
We have a question from the marginalized back row.
Thank you.
Go.
Hi, my name is Tamara Samni. I'm with the International Women's Media Foundation. And we kind of just mentioned this 2016, but I'd like to touch more on the actual election coverage and how everybody, a lot of media outlets, whether Republican or Democrat, fell into this celebrity hype and covering Donald Trump, where he was covered much more than any other candidate. So this is kind of like a two-part question that falls into each other. But what should media outlets consider for the next election, and how with the emergence of digital media, especially Twitter, how can we kind of focus on the actual stories instead of dissecting each and every tweet from the president? And I think that would, I mean, personally reinforce some audience trust.
So I'll merge that into one question. How can
Thank you.
the news media approach this campaign differently, and how does the social and digital apply to that? This is a perennial problem, right? We always say we're going to do it differently, and then shit happens, and we do it the same way.
A lot of work that I've been engaged in lately actually harkens back to an earlier era, and I see Jay Rosen in the front row. Back in the mid-'90s, there was a movement labeled civic or public journalism, and that really came from coverage of the 1994 presidential election, which was so focused on the horse race that the feeling was that issues didn't get any coverage. And so what I'm seeing now is a resurgence in partnerships and opportunities to really double down on issues-based polling and uncovering what's really on the minds of people in America. And the goal in the mid-'90s, and my hope is that the pendulum swings back to there this year, which is instead of covering the candidates from the standpoint of from the candidate on down, we're trying to create an agenda from the voter on up, and having candidates respond to the issues that voters want them to respond to.
Yeah, I mean, this was a massive media fail. I mean, can we all agree on all of that? And two things. Number one, your first question. The way the cable networks gave Donald Trump $1 billion of free, unedited, unreported coverage. I mean, this was media malpractice. That's going to go down as one of the worst decisions. Secondly, obviously, as Mizell points out, it would be a good idea to actually go talk to real people and find out what they're saying, so that we're not completely blindsided by the election results. And number two, I think there was a failure of vetting. Some of the great investigative stories that we've seen in the last couple of years came out after the election. They probably should have been done before the election.
There is a mic there.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dr. Marcus Funk. I'm with Sam Houston State University, and my question.
So you really are doctor, not like.
I really am doctor. I realize that the phrase Dr. Funk is preposterous, though. So but my question is for Mr. Sykes. Your presentation made me think of the Weekly Standard.
Yes.
And their, impromptu, untimely, unfortunate death a couple of months ago. We've talked about conservative media trust in mainstream news media, but the Weekly Standard died in no small part because they lost faith and credibility among American conservative news audiences. So how do you, as a self-described center-right news media, try to cultivate and maintain trust and credibility? And where do you see the rest of the self-described conservative news media ecosystem going?
Well, I worked at the Weekly Standard. And the staff of the Weekly Standard now works with me at the Bulwark. So this is very, very, very intimate. The Weekly Standard didn't die, it was murdered by owners who were dissatisfied that we were not sufficiently pro-Trump, and basically taken the resources and given it to a more pro-Trump publication. So at the Bulwark, we have the core staff of the Weekly Standard, digital staff. And what we are testing is this concept of, is there an audience for center-right, center-left commentary? And it's a question that we are doing. But yes, to a certain extent, the audience moved. And in conservative media, there is a demand that conservative media toe the party line. That conservative media, whether it's Fox News or talk radio or publications, must be a safe space for people who want to keep telling themselves that Trump is okay, that everything is normal. And there was a big blowback against that. But that does not mean that there are not a lot of people who are still looking for a more skeptical view of all of this. So this is the kind of thing that I'm obsessed about, which is the pressure on that center-left, center-right opinion journalism. It is opinion journalism that all of the energy and all of the juice is going to the partisan extremes. And so can we hold something through 2020? I'll get back to you in a couple of years.
Can you wrap up?
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to finish on time. I could ask everybody a final question, and I think I will, but it's a short one. I mean, you know, what we do, journalism reform business is actually pretty healthy these days, a lot healthier than it was 30 years ago, in inverse proportion to the journalism business. Right. Are you fundamentally optimistic? So I'm going to ask you what we call in polling a force question. Which comes closer to your view? Are you fundamentally optimistic or pessimistic about rebuilding trust in the next 10 years?
For the journalists that deserve it, optimistic.
You don't get to answer the question that way, but go ahead. That's okay.
Optimistic.
Good answer.
I would distinguish between optimism and hope. I am not an optimist because I just don't think things are going to get better. I think things are going to get worse over the next few years. But I have hope that truth and facts and fundamental decency will win out in the end. But that's hope more than optimism.
You're going to let him answer.
I don't know him as well.
Well, you know, I've been a journalist since I was 16 years old, so I'm a pessimist. But it does not mean that, you know, I'm not going to work until my dying breath to prove myself wrong.
I think most technology company people are long-term optimists. It's an industry that was built on Moore's Law. And so I am optimistic. I think there's a lot of opportunities for platforms and journalists to work together to improve the relationship between consumers and journalism. And so I am optimistic.
Well, I'll answer my own question. I would say that from studying this junk for way, way too long, Jay and I go way back to when we were young, you can always observe conflicting phenomenons at both times. Sort of both things can be true at the same time because there's stepping back and stepping forward at the same time. I guess I would say that the long arc of history bends towards justice only if you pull. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you so much. This was a great panel.